like nobody deserves to be punished for a crime they did not commit. I don't know. I don't know what could be a more basic and obvious principle of justice than that. And then occasionally somebody says, "But wait, this doesn't Christian doctrine say that we deserve to be punished for a crime that we didn't commit? Oh, we don't have to torture you forever now because instead we killed a completely innocent person. Cool. Oh, but wait, no, we do still have to torture the people who don't believe the thing that I just said is true." It's like the people who don't believe that Jesus came and died for our sins. Now we have to torture them forever because they don't agree with that.
All right, so today we're going to be talking about objections to Christianity. I've got Michael Huemer on. He's a respected and prolific philosopher. You've written something like 70 philosophy papers and various books. You also write on politics.
About 80.
And you work in a university.
University of Colorado in Boulder.
And you teach philosophy.
Yeah. Ethics, political philosophy, epistemology, and a small amount of metaphysics.
Do you have many people interested in metaphysics and epistemology these days?
Among the philosophy majors, sure.
Right. Okay, so thanks for coming on. It's a great honor to speak to you. I've been thinking of inviting you for a long time. Finally got around to it.
Good to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So I saw you on a podcast with a nice Hindu gentleman where you talked about some objections to Christianity. And it sounded like you agree with, I'm a Hare Krishna, and it sounds like you'd agree with a lot of our objections to Christianity. By and large, we agree with a lot of the objections presented by atheists against, like this God who's all loving wants me to suffer in hell for eternity just because I happen to not believe in him. And you want to tell me he's all loving.
Yeah.
Cool story.
Yeah. That's, it's a little hard to understand that. Like, well, and then the explanation of that is, well, like we're all sinners. And so we all deserve to die. Not only to die, but we deserve to be tortured forever because we're sinners. And you're like, wow, okay, how are we all sinners? They're like, well, you see, like back in the beginning, the first man and woman ate a fruit from the tree of knowledge. And so that's why we're all sinners. because somebody else ate from the tree of knowledge, I'm a sinner. Okay, that's theory of original sin. And so I deserve to be tortured forever because that happened.
I think that that idea you just described, I call it cosmic racism.
Yeah.
Because it's this idea that we're punished based on what our ancestors did.
Yeah.
I don't see how that's any different from judging someone based on, well, I guess that's what's going on today with woke culture and what people who look like the people 100 years ago that engaged in slavery are somehow responsible for what people that look like them did 100 years ago.
Yeah. A little bit hard to see this point of view. Sometimes when I'm trying to give an example of a self-evident ethical principle, I use the example, like nobody deserves to be punished for a crime they did not commit. I don't know what could be a more basic and obvious principle of justice than that. And then occasionally somebody says, "But wait, doesn't Christian doctrine say that we deserve to be punished for a crime that we didn't commit?" Yes, it does.
Right. I guess you might have some Christians who object to that principle through what you might want to call ideological motivation.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess you should have a Christian on to find out what they say. Some of them, I suppose, would say, no, it's not because it's not original sin. It's just that you're committing sins in your ordinary life all the time.
That would be a fun debate subject, actually. I have you on to debate a Christian on whether it's ethical to punish someone for a crime they didn't commit.
I don't know what the arguments would be. So like, I would say no, and then they would say what? I don't know.
Yeah, I find I've had a few discussions with Christians about atonement theories, and they get into satisfaction theory of atonements, some of the more sophisticated ones, and
Yeah,
I mean
sorry,
they
what
talk
is
about, well, there's penal substitution, which I think satisfaction theories of atonement are just kind of a reworking of, and by that I mean the same structure of objection can be reworked to object to it for the same reasons. So satisfaction is something like, well, I still think they're saying we did something wrong ourselves because by not accepting Jesus or by not properly honoring Jesus, and because we're fallible humans, we couldn't possibly properly honor Jesus, but somehow, despite it being our nature to do so and us being incapable of doing otherwise, we're still somehow held accountable. So then Jesus comes along and pays the balance for this, except they're not calling it penal substitution. There's not a payment being made for our sin. There's a satisfaction being made because we failed to satisfy God. So Jesus comes and satisfies God. Or I'm probably not accurately representing it, but I think I'm getting the gist.
Yeah. I mean, let's think about how many things are wrong with this story. Okay. So like the beginning of the story, God tells Adam and Eve, don't eat from, or maybe did he just tell Adam? Anyway, he says, don't eat from this tree, because if you do, you'll die. Okay. And it's the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So God was lying. And then Satan comes along and says, oh, no, God was lying. It's not because you'll die if you eat from the tree. It's that he doesn't want you to know. He doesn't want you to be like him, knowing the difference between good and evil. Okay. And so Satan was telling the truth, according to the story. Like, this is not me saying this is not like a Satanist view. This is like, according to Genesis, God was lying and Satan was telling the truth. And they were committing a sin by eating from the tree of knowledge. So the first thing that's wrong with this is the idea that it's a sin to gain knowledge. Like, learning is bad. Okay. So then anyway, so it looks to me like it wasn't a sin at all. It looks like it was praiseworthy. But anyway, and so then, God punishes them, but then also he punishes all of their descendants forever, right? So that's the second thing that's wrong is punishing people who weren't involved in the action. And then the third thing that's wrong is, even if you're to punish someone, what crime deserves infinite punishment? There's no finite crime that deserves infinite punishment. So like, even if it was wrong, and even if somehow your descendants are guilty for a thing that they didn't do, it's still wrong to punish them forever. And then the next thing that's wrong is the idea that, well, we can just we can forego the punishment if we just kill someone else. So, right. So, because this is the traditional Christian story, well, we need to find someone who's completely innocent and then kill that person. And then that's going to make it okay. Now we won't have to punish all of the people who are allegedly actually guilty. Okay. So that's insane. Right.
Someone was telling me that at the time of Jesus' his appearance, there was, in the culture at the time, it was acceptable to have someone else punished on your behalf. So you could send your slave to get your punishment, or your child to get your punishment. And also at that culture, you could, I think, parents were allowed to kill their children. It was a pretty hardcore culture in a lot of ways.
Right. I mean, this just sort of makes the point that the perspective of the Bible is not the perspective of God. It's the perspective of the culture of the particular tribe of people who wrote that book 2,000 years ago. And that's right. It was written by humans 2,000 years ago. That's why it has a outdated morality, right? And, outdated beliefs about the world, which, if it was written by an all-knowing being, it wouldn't have that. It would have the truth, right? That being would know the truth, that he would know all the truths that would ever be discovered.
There's some of the objections we're discussing here bring in points of difference for the Hare Krishna theology, which you might find interesting. So, we have this idea that God's sending messages all over the place throughout history. So we accept Jesus as coming to teach about God, but then it's not just about who came, it's about who was he teaching to. So you could have the same professor, like you're a philosophy professor. You could imagine if you were teaching a bunch of 6-year-olds philosophy, or a bunch of high school dropouts philosophy, or a bunch of people recovering from they just left prison and now they're being rehabituated into society. If you were teaching them philosophy versus teaching postgraduate students, and then the people that you taught then went on to start a tradition. What would it? You get different iterations of what it would look like depending on the caliber of the students. So we understand Jesus had a fairly degraded audience that he was preaching to. So what he was able to deliver and then how much of it they were able to comprehend and carry on with integrity was limited by the caliber of the people. Now, the Christian response to this would be to say, Jesus' mercy is so powerful that it can transform anyone, no matter how degraded, into super amazing theologian. Like they say that about Paul. But my objection to that would be, well, if you look at the Christian doctrine that Paul and Augustine created, Paul being an ex-murderer who would murder people because he didn't like their religious beliefs, the Christian faith went on to become a murderous religion in many regards. A lot of people died because Christians were spreading their faith. And they also, Augustine was a practicing Manichaean for 10 years of his adult life. And Manichaeanism is a very dark idea. It's basically the idea that God is evil. And then you look at Christian ideas of God, and it seems like...
I thought they proposed there were sort of equal good and evil forces. Wasn't that right?
Well, I'm kind of just echoing what I've heard from Dr. Howard Resnick, and I haven't studied it firsthand, so I'm open to being corrected. But I think they'd still... This idea that God is this perfect, all-loving being, it's not what you're going to find in Manichaeanism. There's some dark ideas there too, right?
Yeah.
So I think some of that stuff made its way into the Christian doctrine, because if you look at some of these Christian ideas, it's like... I think some of those ideas of eternal punishment are kind of dark. It's not what you'd expect from an all-loving being.
I mean, it's hard to think of something worse, right? Yeah, so I mean, one thing is, okay, so like, God is writing the Bible allegedly. And so, like the argument is, oh, well, he had to speak to stupid people at the time or whatever, primitive people at the time. Well, so first of all, he knew that Bible would continue in existence for thousands of years because he's all-knowing. So he wasn't just speaking to the people of that time, right? Like he knew that he was speaking to people throughout time. And then the second thing is,
I reject that premise. I think
you think that
Jesus was speaking to the people that were in front of him.
Yeah. But I mean, like he foresaw, didn't he, that there was going to be this religion, there was going to be this book passed down through the generations?
Well, I see that latter outcome as something that's just inevitable. There's just certain things that it's just the part of human nature that this is just what happens. Like we have in the Bhagavatam, there's a story of, there's all sorts of personalities in the Bhagavatam. I'll try not to get into too much detail, but basically Indra, one of the powerful personalities, God with a lower D, but he's in charge of... We see the demigods as like engineers governing the material universe. So, just like in a factory, there's a bunch of engineers making sure everything operates. The demigods are engineers, and they're just spirit souls like you or me, but they happen to have these powerful roles. So Indra was coming, and he was quite insecure in his position and trying to stop the sacrifice from coming. So he's coming and dressing up as a sannyasi, like a renunciate, a spiritual teacher, and stealing the horse to prevent this particular yagya from going on. And every time he did that, a tradition was started up following the personality that he pretended to be. There was a whole new religious tradition that started up every time he came and pretended to be someone. So it's just human nature that anytime somebody comes up and looks like a spiritual figure, a bunch of people start following them and they hand the teachings down. There was even a documentary made where somebody set out to do this in order to educate people on how easily fooled people are, where they made themselves a guru, amassed a huge following, and filmed a whole documentary of the process of them doing it. I can't remember the name right now. Maybe you know it.
I don't know that one. But,
we'll throw it in the description.
I mean, I know that like L. Ron Hubbard started a religion on a bet, basically, something like that. Right. Like, I'm going to prove that I could just start a religion. And it kind of seems like he wanted to show that you could get people to believe the most ridiculous made up stuff.
Yeah. Well, I think if we wanted to put some like everything that happens is for a reason into it, then we would say some people want to be cheated, and God's honoring our free will by allowing us the opportunity to be cheated with false doctrines.
I mean,
And
it seems
if you
like
think you're going to be happy like that, fine. And if you're seeking for the truth is deeper, then you won't be fooled by it. And that whole process of being able to buy into false doctrines allows us to really go deep into experiencing the different things. Like a child, where it's like, don't put your hand in the fire, you'll get burnt. The smart child will listen, but some children just need to put their hand in the fire and get burnt. And a lot of us are like that. We need to learn the hard way by actually being fooled by a false doctrine and figuring out that it doesn't give us what we want and so on. And there's a whole process of soul building that goes on through us going through a variety of different experience and buying into a variety of different ideas and eventually figuring out that we just want the truth and we don't want to be fooled. And all those things I tried were not great.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems like the simpler explanation is there's no God. Wouldn't that be simpler? Like, that's why nobody's stopping the false doctrines, because there's no one to stop them.
No, I think this explanation of like we are the stubborn ones that had to learn the hard way, so God's just allowing us to go about our ignorance so that we can figure out that's not working, and eventually we'll come to the truth. As it's an explanation. It's at least a plausible explanation. You don't have to be convinced by it.
Yeah, I mean, I would think, well, what's the evidence for this? Like, let's look for some empirical predictions from this theory. I mean, I suppose, like, well, if it turned out that everyone at the end of their life, after following false doctrines for a while, at the end of their life, they came to the truth, or what you regard as the truth, then I would say, wow, that's really good evidence, right, for your theory. But
well, add enough lifetimes to it and you'd get there. So watch a million lifetimes of people, and then eventually.
I mean, this depends on, predicting that at some future time, everyone will convert to your religion, right?
I would want to reframe that, because we don't think of it as proselytizing from one religion to another. Like there's elements of truth in different faiths. Of course, we think they're true in as much as they converge on how we understand it, but
yeah, essentially
it's people developing pure love of God, and that can happen in other religions too. And God is very diverse being, so he's not fully captured by the mood that followers of one particular tradition happen to have. You find Sufis who, and I think, different other practitioners of different monotheistic religions who we have a lot in common with, but there's still some differences. So, if you look at different world religions, you find a lot of disagreement if you want to find it. But if you actually look for the ones of the different religions that agree with one another, you find often they'll have more in common with one another than they will with members of their own religion who hold different views. So we use the word bhakti to refer to devotion to God. So if we find the bhakti yogis in Christianity and in Islam and so on, then we would find we have a lot in common with them and say they're on the same path we're on. They just use different names and tell different stories.
Yeah. Okay. So would this be an empirical prediction? Like, love of God should be spreading over time so that we could expect that eventually everyone will have it. Expect that.
There's different seasons. So we're currently in Kali Yuga where things are getting darker, but we're in a mini golden age. So within the dark age, there's a little golden age where there'll be a resurgence of God consciousness. So
okay, so this sounds like an unfalsifiable theory.
Well, yeah, it's unfalsifiable the same way, two frogs could be in their well talking about the ocean, and neither of them have, or one of them has seen the ocean and the other one hasn't. And the one who's seen the ocean is saying, here's what the ocean looks like. And the frog's like, the frog in the well is like, oh, so it's twice as big as my well. No, way bigger. You have no idea. Oh, 100 times bigger than my well. No, you've no clue. So we just have this tiny little fragment of experience that we're going on. And basically, we either have to be agnostic or accept somebody who we think has seen, accept their presentation.
Yeah, seems like we should go with agnosticism. I mean, there are a lot of people from different religions who claim to have seen something, but some of them claim to have seen incompatible things. So like people have religious experiences from different religions, and they claim that their experience supports their religion, but they're often incompatible religions. So what I should think as an external observer is religious experiences are unreliable, right? Like,
Yeah, that's an
so
interesting subject. Have you studied much of the literature on religious experience, or?
oh, not much, no.
No, me
So,
either. I wish I had more. I think it's a fascinating subject, but my comments on that would be that we need to distinguish between the experience itself and the interpretations of the experience. And if we do that, I would posit that we'll find a lot less contradiction. And the contradictions we can find can possibly be resolved using something like the elephant analogy. I'm sure you're familiar with that. Five blind men all holding a different part of the element. And
you're touching different
they're
parts of the
arguing,
element.
but there's actually an overarching explanation which is compatible with all of their experiences, just not with all of their interpretations. I think that was another point I was going to make.
Well, so you could say, oh no, like people are having an experience, which is caused by some genuine spiritual reality, like whatever that means, but they're misinterpreting it. Okay, so that could be, but then, I should say, well, then I shouldn't listen to these people, because everything they tell me is going to be their interpretation of their experience, and their interpretations are unreliable, so I shouldn't listen to them.
Well, I mean, the same is true of victims of crime to some extent. Like, I think police will say you got to take 10% at least off of the story of the victim in every case, because that always gets a bit exaggerated in their mind. But that doesn't mean you don't listen to them completely. They've got their interpretations of what happened, but you still listen to the story they tell and figure out whatever is vertical and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, this is a good analogy. Like, what if there were several witnesses to a crime? Well, if they generally agree with each other, then you'd go, okay, so the thing that they generally agree on is probably true. But if they're widely disagreeing with each other, then you're like, I have no idea what happened. I don't even know if a crime happened at all, right? One of them says like there were 12 bank robbers. The other one says there was one. One of them says it wasn't even a robbery, whatever. Then you're like, okay, well, I don't know, maybe nothing happened.
Yeah, I mean, if there's overarching themes that are true of all of the experiences, then it's like, well, they all heard a loud sound. Then it's like, okay, something made a loud sound. Probably was a gunshot, because gunshot fits the description that all of them have, even though one of them thinks the car crash or whatever. But another thing I'd want to say on the diversity of religious experience is God will appear to people in a way that's relatable to them. So if someone's a Christian and they're expecting God to appear a certain way and have these ideas of Jesus, then it makes sense for God to appear like Jesus, or for God to send Jesus as their apparition, because that's going to be relatable to them, and God's having a loving relationship for us. So why would he appear in some way that's so far outside of our expectations that it doesn't bring out the relationship nicely?
I mean, I would think that he would want to give us knowledge of the truth, and also that he would not want to sow confusion by giving different messages to different people. So he'd want to have a consistent appearance across different people, right?
Yeah.
Especially knowing how much conflict is caused by people having conflicting religious beliefs, right?
We're turning from piling on Christianity to having an interesting philosophical discussion on the philosophical strength of Hare Krishna theology, but this is fun. So one thing I'd say to that is that we look at it as God as having a different goal. So often, the skeptical position will be like, wouldn't God just want us to all know the truth? And an analogy I'd want to give for that is so I think the correct analogy between us and God is a child compared to a very wise adult, not like an ordinary human who's like ignorant and watches TV and raises their kids poorly, and someone very wise. And when in those relationships, sometimes the parent isn't thinking of giving the child necessarily 100% correct beliefs, but about giving the child a disposition that will make them succeed in life. So if they misunderstand something slightly, but they're on a trajectory to become a very well refined, skilled, talented, successful, happy adult. You're not going to worry if they happen to have a false belief right now. You're just going to worry about them becoming successful later in life, and it doesn't really matter what they believe now because they're going to grow out of that.
Yeah. Okay, so it sounds like another theory that it seems to me should make some empirical predictions. So like I should have the empirical prediction that after people have religious experiences, then like they act morally in their life or whatever, right? Something like that. But actually
that should be, yeah.
Some of these religious messages, like, people will go on to, like Muhammad goes on to found this religion, and then he attacks neighboring tribes and takes them over, and then like his followers thousands of years later are still attacking the infidels, killing apostates and stuff. So
yeah, I mean, I haven't really studied that from the angle of being an apologist for it. Not really.
It's difficult. But I mean, also with Christianity, like there was a whole bunch of crimes committed in the name of Jesus, right? And God.
Okay, yeah. I mean, the Christian story I'm a little bit more familiar with, and I would chalk that up to ideas I already presented, where Jesus gave helpful teachings, and then some of his followers misunderstood them. And I think the correct way to think of it is like Hare Krishnas are often using this hospital analogy. So we think, oh, we're Hare Krishnas, so we're becoming better people, right? And we look around the Hare Krishna movement, and we're not exactly surrounded by the highest specimens of human being in all cases. And we think, is the process even working? And the answer is, well, you're in a hospital, so of course you're going to be surrounded by sick patients. But think how bad these people would be if they weren't in the hospital. And you're going to say it's unfalsifiable now, right? Because it's like, well, yeah. What would Islamic culture look like today if it weren't for the appearance of Muhammad and the spread of Islam? I don't have an answer for that, but I think that's the correct question.
Yeah, no. I mean, you imagine a doctor who insists that he has these really good treatments, but like he has these patients who are like sick and dying, right? And when you ask for evidence, he's just always like, well, they would be even worse if they didn't come to me. Like,
right.
I have no evidence of that. I mean,
I think we've seen some arguments like that in the past couple of years, which are pretty weak arguments. Yeah, so there would need to be some measurable improvements. And another thing I'd want to say, which you're going to say, well, it's just unfalsifiable, is that we need to filter for those people who are having improvements in character. So if someone has a religious experience and then just goes back to being the same brute that they were yesterday with no improvement in character, then I would question whether it was an actual spiritual experience or just something they mistook for a spiritual experience. Again, I'd say this is a plausible hypothesis, and maybe when we want to add more features, it's like, okay, well, there's got to be some characteristics to a genuine spiritual experience other than just whether it fits with your empirical predictions or not.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to say that sounds unfalsifiable. So, I mean, it's sort of like, well, if you don't start out already convinced that some religion is true, right, then it's a problem that there are all of these like untestable theories, right? Like,
yeah, I mean,
like if you're totally convinced that the religion is true, then it might sound fine to say all these things.
Right? Yeah, I guess that's a bit like solipsism versus external world realism. They all share all the same predictions, so it's just about which one you happen to be convinced of already, if you're going based on.
Yeah. I mean, people say that, but I don't think solipsism predicts anything.
Well, I heard your discussion with T. Jump, and it was you pointed out that external world realism and solipsism could share all the same phenomenological predictions.
I mean, solipsism is logically compatible with having experiences of an external world, but it doesn't predict experiences of an external world, right? So, like, I take it that solipsism is just the view that there's nothing outside your own mind. So if there's nothing outside your own mind, then you wouldn't predict that you would have experiences that seem to represent a physical world. It's logically possible that you could have any series of experiences, but you just wouldn't expect right? There's no particular reason why you should have experiences that look like representations of external objects.
Yeah, well, I guess it would be solipsism star, where you add in this idea of something like the external world. But yeah, maybe it's not a good comparison to what we're discussing.
You can put in like the brain in the vat scenario, and then you can add some stuff about the scientists who are trying to create a perfect simulation of life in the early 21st century or something like that. And they have like amazingly good computers and everything. And then you predict that you would have an experience just like this, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so probably not a good comparison. So generally how someone becomes convinced of the kind of thing I'm talking about is they go to a Hare Krishna program, they saw these bright, shiny Hare Krishnas, and they think these people have something I want, and they keep coming along, start eating the food, start chanting the chants, and before long, they start to feel a positive transformation in their own consciousness. And they were told, here's the practices and here's the results you get. They apply the practices and they get those results, and they're like, this seems legit. It's like if someone's giving you, the analogy for this would be you ask for directions, you don't know if the person knows what they're talking about, you don't know if the person's lying or not, but you don't have anything else to do, so you follow their directions, and they say, go here, take this train, hop off here, and then you'll see this building. When you see that building, go right, and then walk for a while, you'll see a river. And as you're walking and you see the train, you see the building, you see the river, you think, you become more and more confident that the story the person told you is true, and you're actually going to get to the correct destination, even though you don't actually know if you're going to get to the correct destination. You just have confirmation of an increasing amount of the story you were told.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really matters what kinds of things the person is predicting. So, right, so this person makes a bunch of claims, and like some of them are claims about ordinary sort of natural phenomena, and then they also make some supernatural claims, right? And then you say, I confirmed some of the natural phenomena, right? Like I confirmed their predictions about stuff that could happen normally through natural causes, and so now I believe their claims about supernatural things. I think, no, you shouldn't make that extension. You have to actually, because the supernatural stuff is of a different kind. And so you need to observably confirm that stuff, some of that independently. And then,
All right. I'm thinking of an analogy for that. Like, say I make 100 stock market predictions, and all 100 of them turn out to be true, and people make billions of dollars off it. And my final prediction is that in 10 years, there will spontaneously be flying pigs.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I'd be like, so look, I mean, maybe this guy's an awesome business analyst so that he could predict stock market movements, but that doesn't extend to his, correctly predicting flying pigs. Right, like that, I think that would be the reasonable thing to think.
But so the way these predictions relate to the supernatural claims is the story of why it works is directly related to the existence of God. So we're unsatisfied because we have a God-shaped hole in the heart, and that's why we're going around chasing things and constantly unsatisfied and depressed, and lusting after things and not getting them and being angry, or getting them and being disappointed, or getting them and being anxious that it's going to be taken away. So we're basically in anxiety and hankering all the time, or lamenting for something we've lost, or insecure about something being taken away. That's the constant state of chasing material pleasures. And the reason is because God's the only thing that can satisfy us. So if you develop a relationship with God, you'll become satisfied. And then people do these practices, which, chanting God's names, hearing stories about God, building friendships with God's devotees, honoring God in various ways. And they have that same experience of becoming deeply satisfied, losing anxiety, losing hankering for things, and so on. Yeah. Then it seems to fit.
I see. I mean, I think those experiences could be explained, by alternative naturalistic theories that wouldn't require there to actually be a God. It could be true that people have this hankering after the divine, even if there is no divine. By the way, I don't know if there's a God or not. I'm agnostic, so that could be true. but I think it just could be that, we're sort of like wishing for this thing because it would be so great if it existed. It doesn't have to actually exist. You see what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, we have a repeated experience of everything else that we hanker for existing. So, if we're deprived of oxygen,
No.
we get a hankering to breathe. If we're, there's thirst,
Oh,
hunger, and all of
yeah, but
these
I mean,
things have a,
people like totally fantasize about things that aren't real, right? I mean,
yeah, they can fantasize about things that aren't real, but there's, for whatever they're fantasizing about that isn't real, there's a corollary of something that is real, but just not as fantastic. So you could imagine kinds of food that don't exist, but there's food that does exist that's somewhat satisfying. And for everything that we have a hankering for, there's something that would kind of, meet that need, even if it's not as fantastic as what we're fantasizing. So why not for this God thing?
yeah, I mean, some people say, yeah, like the hankering for God is like that, right? It's sort of like, I think there's the Freudian explanation that, it's like a giant father figure or something. And, only it's like a superior father that will never leave you and something like that. And you can protect you from everything, as you like, sort of like the ideal parent, right? When your real parents can't protect you from everything and they're not perfect and everything. So,
Well, I guess what you're trying to draw a comparison of God to what I was describing of we have something less fantastic. Like we have real, you know, there might not be this particular like sports car that you want, but there's other cars. There's other ways of getting that fast, adrenaline rush even without that car that doesn't exist that you're fantasizing about. Similarly, you want a perfect father figure. Well, we have ordinary father figures. We just don't have a perfect one. So you might be saying there's an analogy there that God is like that kind of thing. Whereas I want to say God is like the difference between water and food. He's another thing, another category.
yeah,
Meets another need. So, like each of these items, food, water, interpersonal relationships, they meet a different need that the soul has. If babies don't have human connection, they die. It's a need. So for everything that there's a need, there's something that meets that need. So similarly, we would say that this God meets a different need in that way.
yeah, yeah. So, like, I guess we could think about, well, is God categorically different from a idealized parental figure? I guess superficially, it does sound like, you could view God as like an ideal parent, right? As a matter of fact, like the Christians sometimes call him the Father, right? Our Father who art
Yeah.
in heaven, whatever. So, like maybe people's feelings about God are like that. Um,
Yeah, I think it's a different category though, because your parents is someone you have a relationship with in a kind of ordinary way, whereas God is someone who sits inside your heart and is the foundation of your being. That's kind of a different sort of relationship in some important ways.
I don't know. Yeah. I mean, maybe it's, just different because he's like idealized and he's supposed to be perfect. Like, right. Because like, wouldn't it be great if your parents were in your heart or whatever? I don't know. Um,
um, yeah, possibly.
um,
I think there's lots of subject matter for some interesting philosophical papers here.
yeah.
That these ideas could be explored. I don't know if we should come back to some of the objections to Christianity. It sounds like a lot of it, the discussion is probably going to be how Hare Krishna ideas differ, and then you'll just bring up new objections rather than your typical objections to Christianity.
That might happen.
But
It happens sometimes. Yeah.
no, it's fun. What was there was oh yeah, so we have this idea of God giving unlimited chances. So, the Christian atonement theory is basically you get it right now or that's it, you get punished for eternity. And it's like there's a number of objections that could be offered to that. Um, I actually have
Yeah.
a forthcoming philosophy paper I wrote with another with Adi Purush, Akshay Gupta, who's doing a PhD dissertation on the problem of evil, and we listed out various of these objections. Like, yeah, basically, it's just amounts to various reasons why it's not fitting to give someone an infinite punish because it's a finite crime. People can't understand the nature of what they're doing. So, you don't, if a 3-year-old does something, accidentally fires a gun and kills somebody, they don't go to prison for the rest of their life because they don't understand what they're doing. So similarly, if we don't understand the offense we're committing about God, it doesn't make sense to give us an infinite punishment. And so many objections like this, and basically the way we answer it is to say we are giving fitting punishments, and that's how karma and reincarnation works. So you do something wrong in this life, you either suffer a reaction for it in this life or a future life. And it's not punitive, it's reformative. The point of giving your reaction is because you have a particular mentality that caused you to do that action, and you're still going to have that mentality in the future, chances are. So that reaction is tailor-made to that mentality in order to transform it, to reform it, to teach you soul-building lessons, so you eventually become such a high-quality individual that you can enter a realm full of only high-quality individuals, and we call that place the spiritual world, or Christians will call it heaven. And that's why you can have free will somewhere, and it doesn't get abused because people have been refined to a high level of character.
Yeah. I mean, so, yeah, so, like a response to the problem of evil is, oh yeah, don't worry, people will become reformed in the future. And I think, sometimes just in the sort of like Christian doctrine where there's no reincarnation, there's only this life and then the infinite afterlife, then they say, well, sometimes you're learning something from your suffering. Right. And then my response to that is usually, so sometimes that's true, but sometimes it's not. Right. So if you observe people, like frequently the suffering that they go through makes them worse. And like children who are abused then go on to become criminals. Right. And so it doesn't really look like, it doesn't really look like the suffering is always, for a greater purpose. Okay. But then I suppose you would say, no, they're going to be better in another lifetime, in their next lifetime.
Yeah.
And there's no way of testing that because we can't track the souls, right? Like, you don't know what their next life, if we could identify them in their next lifetime, then we could see if that was true. But we can't.
Yeah, I think it's a place for intellectual humility. So if there's two hypotheses that can't be decided based on evidence, then you can't use those particular reasons to reject or accept it. So I think that fails as an objection, and we just have to go back to whether we have other reasons for objecting or accepting it.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I would say, just like, I don't know, the simplest explanation for why there's suffering is right, there's just no one to stop it, right? And so you posit that it produces some great benefit later, but we just don't have any evidence of that benefit. So,
well, we have examples basically in every category of suffering you find, because we can all find egregious cases of suffering. Somebody's house burns down, somebody gets some terrible illness, somebody's abused growing up. In every example we can find of that, we can find an individual who rose up out of the ashes from that and said, these experiences made me who I am today.
Yeah. I mean, so, like in evaluating theories, you have to sort of say, not just like, can my theory account for such and such evidence, but also can alternative views account for it, right? So like, what would I expect if my theory wasn't true? And the answer is, well, I'd expect the same thing, right? If there was no God, I would also expect there to be a variety of different responses that people have to suffering. And like some people will respond well and other people will respond badly, and it'll just look kind of random.
Well, I think if we put this in the right dialectical context, so I'm giving answers to an objection here, and if my objections say, okay, it's compatible with the evidence, then I think the objection fails, and then we just go back to whether there's other reasons for believing it.
Well, I think like our starting position should be just like what's the simplest explanation, right? And then, when somebody starts giving explanations, like to me, it's like the people responding to the problem of evil, they give sort of like complicated postulates that can't be tested. And it's just like, it's just like a weird coincidence that, the best way for God to arrange things is to make everything look exactly as if he wasn't there. Because this is a pretty big thing. If there's a God, that's a pretty big thing. That's a big difference in the world. It's just like a really weird coincidence that it doesn't have any testable implications, right? That would enable you to differentiate that situation from the situation where there's no God.
Yeah, I'm going to want to bring the frog in the well analogy again and say we just have a tiny experience of a tiny fragment of time. Like, if we take the story the Vedas present of time, then it says for most of human history, people have been devoutly religious, followed Vedic culture, and it's just in Kali Yuga for the small window of time that people are degraded, and this material world that's only on the middle planets, and the middle planets are just a small section of the higher planets. Everybody knows about Vedic culture and the truth of the Vedas. And then even that material universe is just one tiny fragment of the entire spiritual world, which is far larger. So most people never even left the spiritual world and are still having pure relationship with God. And then of people in the material world, most of them understand this knowledge about God. And even in the parts of the material existence where people forget about God, it's only in certain points in history where that happens, and we happen to be one of those points of history. Of course, I'm just giving you another unfalsifiable idea. But
yeah, some of that sounds like referring to things that I haven't observed. Like there are other planets where people have true religious knowledge or something, but I don't have any evidence of those existing. So I'm just like, well, I just have to look at the stuff that I could observe, and like it's just like weird, that the spiritual realities don't make any distinctive impact, right? Where I can verify that it's different from what would be the case if they didn't exist, right?
Well, you can verify it by taking up the practice yourself and having the first-hand spiritual experience for yourself.
Well, I don't think that I can do that while not believing in it.
Well, yeah, we posit that it's a powerful experience, that you can do it provided you suspend your disbelief. So you don't have to believe it, but you have to just suspend your disbelief enough to actually invest yourself in it somewhat.
Yeah. I mean, like I don't think that like an atheistic philosophy would predict that people wouldn't have religious experiences, really. Like, right, so I'm not sure that this is going to make different predictions, from what naturalism would predict. Right. Like,
well, I mean,
like you gotta tell me something where it's like, if that happens, there would be no naturalistic explanation, right?
Well, of course, that would be the case for miracles and the evidence for reincarnation and near-death experiences and so on.
Yeah.
We could get into empirical discussions on all that sort of stuff, but probably neither of us are prepared for that.
Right. Yeah.
Although I've done a fair bit of study on the evidence for reincarnation. I don't know if you've looked at all at the work of Dr. Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker.
I looked at it a little bit. Yeah.
I find that stuff interesting.
Yeah. Actually, I mean, they say some amazing things. But I think the truth is not as amazing as it sounds. So, right. So I looked at some of the stuff they said, but then I also looked at some of their critics, and then it looked like the critics were pretty convincing. So, like there's this stuff where they're talking about this kid who thought that he was the reincarnation of a World War II pilot, and then they had all this all this stuff that the kid said, and then like they explained how it matched the life of this particular pilot who had died, and in some battle in World War II, right?
Yeah.
Okay, but then
James Leininger.
Yeah, I forgot the name. Maybe, yeah. But so but then like I read this response to that where the guy is explaining how like multiple of the items that are supposed to be amazing coincidences are pieces of information that the kid could have gotten when he went to a flight museum, which like coincidentally had a bunch of this information that later appeared, right? And he started talking about this, about whatever his dreams about being in the airplane after he went to that museum. So you're like, well, that's a weird coincidence.
Yeah, I looked into that case. There's more details than that though. Like the plane that James said he flew wasn't at the museum at the time, and like he knew things like, oh yeah, that plane got flat tires a lot. Yeah, the Corsair. Yeah, the Corsair wasn't. Oh yeah, he didn't crash in a Corsair, but he flew Corsairs, and the Corsairs were notable to remember because it was a special thing to get to fly Corsairs. They were better planes. They were testing them out for the military, but he crashed in a different plane. And they didn't have a Corsair on display in that particular museum when he visited. It had somehow got damaged or something, so they had a different plane on display. And like he remembered details like, oh, they got flat tires a lot. And like that information wouldn't have been presented to him. That's something pilots would know because flat tires when you're landing are going to be a real problem. You're going to remember that, right? And he remembered the name. He remembered like the way that he went down. He remembered lots of details.
Well, I mean, what I recall was because it turned out that the father bought a videotape from the museum, and that kid watched that videotape many times over. And I have not viewed the videotape, which I would like to see, right? But apparently it had a bunch of information in it. So anyway, so if it turns out that like, several of the things that are supposed to be amazing pieces of information that the kid knows are actually in that videotape, but then there's a few where you can't figure out where he would have gotten it. I'm going to say, well, he probably got it from somewhere else that we haven't tracked down, right?
There's I don't know if that's the strongest case. That's an interesting case because it's got World War II and pilot crashing and stuff, but I think there's some stronger cases. Like there's one case where a girl remembered the past life of an individual, and they did somewhat of a controlled memory test where they brought in people from the previous personalities that knew the previous personality and said, can you tell us who this person is? And like one of the people came in was like the brother or someone like that girl, the previous personality, had a bad relationship with. It's like, can you tell us who this is? And she's like, no. What to like, and like, so for every person that she remembered the correct kind of mood, and it was always the mood the person had at the end of the last life. So it was like a carryover, and like she could name people and be like, oh yeah, that's so and so, that was my teacher. And they brought in one person who was like a decoy, like the person didn't know, and she's like, I don't know this person, and stuff like that's pretty interesting. Of course, you're just going to say if that's the case, if it was well executed, but how do we know they're not just fudging it or executed it poorly and so on?
Know. I mean, so like I don't think that I read about that case, so I don't know. But I guess I just say like, sort of, okay, it would be amazing if this was true, and I hope that it is because it's so cool. But like when I hear claims like this, and then I do more reading, it just very frequently turns out that it's not as amazing as it sounds. It just frequently turns out that like some skeptic writes about it, and then they show how there are prosaic explanations for most of the events.
Well then you got to go on to read the response to the critics from somebody who's read into it quite well. But yeah, I suppose we can leave that one there. I think the empirical discussions are fascinating, but there's no use in us just like grasping for straws trying to remember these cases. So, where we were with that talking about? Oh yeah, you were talking about how if it's compatible with both hypotheses, then why believe it?
Yeah, I was sort of thinking, take the simplest hypothesis, right? Which is, no gods. No, that's the simplest.
Well, then we could get into various other philosophical reasons for believing in God, like having a first cause. A classic Hare Krishna argument from God that's not really made into the philosophical literature, as far as I know, we could call a construction argument. Prabhupada, the guru of the Hare Krishna movement, so to speak, he used this argument a lot. Life comes from life. The source has to have all the qualities of the creation. So we are people, so God has to be a person, and so on. And just to give a little bit of background, because I know the typical objections would be like, well, I can make, you mix oxygen and hydrogen together and you get water, and water has properties that neither of those things on their own had. Or you can take a bunch of ingredients and make a cake that is spongy, and none of those ingredients had sponginess before you made the cake. But what you're doing in all of those cases is you're creating an iteration of existing properties. So the properties water has are basically a certain propensity to cling on to other molecules and a certain propensity to break down the bonds of other molecules. That's why things dissolve in water, and that's why water sticks to itself, sticks to surfaces. That's why it's good for cleaning. And of course, the phenomenological experience of the quality we have of wetness that's a completely different question. I'm just talking about the physical properties here, which is basically what's presented when people give this objection. And hydrogen and oxygen also have different degrees to which they bond to other molecules and so on. So when we vary those propensities to bond to make it stronger or weaker, then we get water. Whereas if we wanted to have, dull matter and have it become conscious, that's a completely new property that's being brought in. So we argue that you can't have consciousness come from dull matter. You have to have consciousness come from consciousness. So God has to have all the qualities of the creation, which is basically a key distinguishing factor of the Hare Krishna theology. It's not impersonalism. It's not this idea that at the bottom of the reality is this, nirguna Brahman. So the Advaitavadis, our philosophical nemesis going back in Indian traditions, they say at the foundation of reality you find something devoid of all qualities. We take those same statements from the same descriptions and say nirguna means devoid of material qualities but full of spiritual qualities, and the spiritual qualities have all the features we find in the material world minus all the negatives. So we find when you take a mirror image of something, it becomes degraded. The sun reflecting on the river, on the lake, it looks like the sun there, but you can destroy the reflection by throwing a stone and you can't destroy the sun. So there's different things that you lose when you have a reflection that make it degraded. So we find all these qualities there. So a construction argument. So you want to make a table, you need a certain amount of wood, you need a certain amount of tools, you need a certain amount of intelligence, and you need more ideas than it takes to make the wood, the table. You need more timber than it takes to make the table, and you need more wood than it takes to make the table. You have to have offcuts. You have to have, and so on. And that's how you make the table. So, and the combination of all those factors, it's like the proportionality principle. All of those causes have to be capable of producing that effect. So for the world to exist, God has to be full of all these qualities in excess of anything we see here.
This might be an overgeneralization. I mean, so like taking examples and overgeneralizing from them to qualities in general, but you don't even mean qualities in general, actually, right? Because it sounded like your argument was really like, well, with physical qualities, you can get like surprising physical qualities by combining together, particular atoms. It's just that there's no explanation for how you get consciousness from purely physical properties, right? And okay, so like maybe the idea is, well, you can't have a completely different class of properties, right? Arising, whatever, out of another class. Okay, and so I don't know why consciousness exists. I don't know what caused it.
But we have an explanation.
But I'm not even sure that explanation explains it. So like I'm conscious, but I can't create any more consciousness.
Well, we actually say we don't have this idea of creation ex nihilo. We say the material energy is God's energy, and it's always existed. One name for it would be pradhan. So between material creations, there's like cyclical creation and destruction, almost like a big bang, big crunch kind of idea. And between creations, it's this clump, and it's called pradhan. And then
so like I believe, just like in terms of physics, I believe in conservation of energy. So like, there's some fundamental stuff that there's a fixed amount of, and I think it just goes on forever. It goes back in time forever and into the future forever.
So we say the same thing about consciousness. Individual souls have always existed.
Oh yeah, that is my view. Yeah, I think every soul exists forever.
Right, and then we just add God to that.
or not, So I mean, like for me, okay, why are there souls? In my view, as well, they always existed. So you don't need any explanation of what created them, but you do still need an explanation of like how souls get embodied, right? Like why there are conscious living things, and I don't know the answer to that. I suppose there are some presently unknown laws of nature, psychophysical laws, as the philosophers say, the analytic philosophers say. laws that somehow connect particular physical configurations to particular experiences. But I mean, I think, well, I mean, you need that anyway. Like, even if there is a God, there still have to be psychophysical laws.
Yeah, well, one thing you can get with the God is teleology. So the reason why I'm in this particular body is because I have things to learn in this body, things to do, and the reason why other. So we have this idea that the particular body you get is suited for your the nature you cultivated in a last life. So if someone's not acting like a human and just out there basically acting like an animal in whatever ways, classic thing we might say is if you just want to eat meat all the time, you'll become a tiger. If you just want to have sex all the time, maybe you'll become a pigeon, and so on. But if you're making use of this human form of life, and we also say this human form of life has this particular opportunity because we can use it to learn about God and develop pure love of God, whereas in animal bodies we're limited to, we're basically just living out our karma and acting according to the body we've got at the time.
Yeah, like I wish that I could test this by seeing what bodies people wind up in. Like, I wish I could re-identify souls so that I could see what body somebody ends up in the next time they get incarnated.
Well, it'd be interesting to analyze the cases of lives that Ian Stevenson matched up and see
see if there was a pattern.
What patterns there are. I read they did some pattern analysis, and they said, they noticed that different patterns in Western countries from India, but in India they didn't find what they expected based on their predictions. I emailed Jim Tucker and invited him on the podcast, and he wasn't interested, I think, because he tries to keep his work very distant from being apologetics for any religion. He's just just looking at the data, presenting the data, and he doesn't want his academic reputation to be tarnished by being seen shilling for a religion, which I think is probably smart because he probably comes under heavy scrutiny.
As a philosopher, I don't have to worry about that.
Yeah, I think philosophy is one of the last vestiges of intellectual integrity you find in academia, where basically across the board, people don't really care who you are, what your beliefs are. They just want to look at your arguments and see if they hold water.
Yeah.
Whereas you don't even find that in medicine anymore.
Oh, really?
No, I mean, look at Norman Fenton. He opposed some of the ideas around COVID, and he's a statistician specializing in risk. So he's and he's just at retirement age, so he's got decades of experience behind him, specializing in risk. He's the guy, like, when medical researchers want to figure out what their data means and if they've done it right, they go to someone like him, and he looks at the statistics and be like, oh no, you're looking at this wrong. Here's what the data actually means. And he looked at a lot of the data for some of the COVID stories they were telling and told a different story with, hard argumentation. And now he can't get published. Even if he wants to publish something completely unrelated, people won't accept his papers because of what he said about COVID, even though he's a complete expert in his field. So, some issues have become politicized, and then when that happens, then even the scientists will forget scientific norms, right? Or they'll, if they're smart, they'll just stay out of it, right? Maybe that's why.
If I'm a scientist, I might go well, I'm just not going to study this. I'm not going to study COVID-19 or race or gender or whatever, because if I do, I might find out the wrong thing.
You could call that smart, or you could call that cowardice.
Yeah, either one.
It might be important for the world to know what the truth is on these matters. And if everybody who has a dissenting view is just I'm just not going to study that because I'd rather keep my career, then the world's probably going to suffer because we're going to have less truth tracking in our institutions.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So sorry.
Yeah, no, but we need to sort of stop politicizing issues because.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe the reason why philosophy is one of the last strongholds where it doesn't matter what your credentials are or what you believe is because it's not politicized. a
Or like
particular
I don't.
epistemology over another one. Nobody's gonna like consider you a bad human being because you believe in phenomenal conservatism or reject phenomenal conservatism. It's just a difference of opinion on one particular matter, and it doesn't extend to anything else.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't think philosophy is that different from other fields. I mean, like, well, phenomenal conservatism hasn't been politicized, but there are, right? But that's just like how many scientific issues haven't been politicized. And so, like, if it's not politicized and they're just doing regular science, and you can kind of trust what they're saying, right? And the same thing is true about philosophers. But like, if you take a political or politicized philosophical issue, then like, no, you can't really trust the philosophers either, which is very disappointing to me, but that's the case, right? Like,
What are some examples of politicized philosophy?
like, so like, there's a famous example now in the philosophy world, right? Like, there's this article by Rebecca Tuvell, which was about transracialism. It appeared in the journal Hypatia. Okay, and basically she was arguing that there's a parallel between transgenderism and transracialism. So if people can just like identify as another gender from what they appear to be, why can't people also identify as a different race from what they appear to be? And her point with this, by the way, was the modus ponens, not the modus tollens. Her point was transracialism is fine. People should be able to change to another race if they want to. All right. But then, a bunch of people like started attacking her, and like they had this online petition to try to get her article retracted from the journal. Okay. It did not work because, the journal editor rejected this. And then, when it became clear that the campaign to cancel Tuvell was not working, then a bunch of people wanted their names taken off the petition. Okay. Which showed that they didn't believe that shit. They were just, blowing with the winds, right?
Yeah.
Like piling on because, hey, I see a bunch of people kicking somebody on the ground. I bet I could go in there and get in a few kicks for fun, right? That's kind of like,
Well, it's that, or it's virtue signaling, where it's like I want my career to do well, so I want to be seen doing all the things that I need to be seen doing in order to get all the respect and promotions that I'm hoping to get.
Yeah.
Which
that's
something I don't have any kind words for, because I think intellectuals have a job to do in helping us find the truth. And if they're not doing that, they should just go and dig holes or something.
Yeah, sure, yeah. There are a lot of holes need to be dug, Anyway, so I mean, philosophers are not generally brave people. Like there's some ways that philosophers are good. Like they're generally smart people. They're generally more rational even than other academics, but they are not more brave.
Right. But with that example you gave, I think that philosophical point that was made in that paper could have been made in the same way, just using a non-controversial example. So I don't know if it's an example of politicized philosophy or just philosophy that happened to touch on a politicized subject.
Well, I mean, the point of it was to defend transracialism. So, I think people were upset about that. And then I think they sort of like made up reasons to be upset. Like they were like, oh, the author dead named Caitlyn Jenner. So there's because there's a point in it when the author refers to when Caitlyn Jenner was Bruce, right? Meaning before her transition. And then people are like, oh, you dead named him, her, or whatever. So, but anyway, and like Caitlyn Jenner doesn't have a problem referring to that period of her life as Bruce. So anyway, so like that struck me as a disingenuous complaint. But anyway.
Yeah, that's a funny one. A lot of this woke ideology is people getting upset on other people's behalf, and in many cases, those other people actually didn't ask for that to be done for them.
Yeah.
But anyway, maybe we should bring this back to objections to Christianity. Did we have more to say on atonement theories or punishment?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I think I kind of made my main points about that. So seems like a extremely unjust theory, right? like there's this extremely unjust punishment, and then there's an extremely unjust way of saving people from it. Right.
Yeah.
Then the other part, okay, so like, oh, we don't have to torture you forever now because instead we killed a completely innocent person. Cool. Oh, but wait, no, we do still have to torture the people who don't believe the thing that I just said is true. It's like the people who don't believe that Jesus came and died for our sins. Now we have to torture them forever because they don't agree with that.
Oh yeah.
Okay. So like every part of this is insane.
Yeah, I like to talk to Muslims and Christians and say, let's accept the premise that God is the greatest being imaginable, and then let's compare God conceptions and see which of our God conceptions is most compatible with God being the greatest being imaginable. I've tried to organize debates on that, and none of them are biting. Probably because it's not their wheelhouse and that's not their focus. They say, I don't know the Hare Krishna conception of God very well, or sometimes they just don't reply. But I think that would be an interesting debate. And like what you just described, that's not what you'd expect a loving God to do. You'd expect him to give us future opportunities to have a go at it, and
my main problem with Christianity, I think, is that a lot of the doctrines sound to me like more like things that a very primitive human 2,000 years ago would have thought than like things that a very great and wise being would think, right? It's like if there was something written by a supremely perfect being, I would expect it to be a lot more impressive than the Bible. Like I would expect it, when I read it, I would expect it to not sound like primitive people 2,000 years talking to me. I would expect it to be full of profound insights. I would expect it to be like the most profound book, and like to have wisdom far beyond the time that it was in and stuff like that. And, but instead it's just like, you should stone people to death if they're gay. And like, okay, it's like what a very prejudiced primitive person might think.
So I think if you study Bhagavatam, you'll find it's more impressive. That's my.
I suppose it doesn't have those things about like stoning people to death.
No, the morality we find in Bhagavatam, well, the way it's typically talked about is we don't find Krishna and Bhagavad Gita telling Arjuna really mundane morality things. Like in the Quran, there's a statement, don't have sex with your mother. Now, you shouldn't have to say that to somebody. And if you do need to say that, something's probably wrong with the person you're talking to.
You could say that. Yeah.
Now, we don't find stuff like that in Bhagavad Gita. The instructions are they're assuming a high level of human morality already, and then just propounding on spiritual subject matters. And then at the end of Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, now you've heard these instructions, do what you will. So deliberate and make your own decisions. It's kind of an educational thing, like here's the knowledge, make your own decisions. But the key factor I want to pull forward is that the morality is very largely about getting insights from somebody alive today who has imbibed these teachings. So it's described, the path is found in the heart of the pure devotee. So I think this is pretty analogous to if you want to be a heart surgeon, you don't just get a textbook, get some scalpels and start cutting people up and reading the book. That's not how you become a surgeon. If you want to get a surgeon, you go and find people who are alive today, who have decades of experience cutting people open and fixing their hearts, and you get tutored by them. So similarly, if you want to understand these teachings of Bhagavatam, you find somebody who's imbibed it and is living it, and they have the insights in order to understand how it applies to you, how it applies in modern society. And so it's not this rigid morality of, it says here this is wrong, so we can't do this here, and it says here we need to do these things, so we need to do this things here. And often it's like, if you look at it with your intelligence, you're like, yeah, but I'm not sure that in this specific situation it applies in that way. Maybe we need to draw on some other principles. So it's more like a principles-based morality rather than injunctions-based. And we don't find homosexuality really mentioned at all. What we do find is that sex outside of marriage is condemned, and lust in general is condemned, other than for the propagation of children, which means a heterosexual couple having sex with no intention of producing children, actively trying to prevent pregnancy, would be just as condemnable as homosexuals. Because that's the only principles we laid out. Of course, there's like ultra-conservative Hare Krishnas who are going to disagree with me, and then there's more liberal Hare Krishnas who I'd say go too far the other way. But I think I have kind of middle-of-the-road position that, like, somebody's gay, like, whatever, get married, like, be monogamous about it, and just try to somehow or other fix your mind on God.
Oh, but, like, they can't have children, right? So
they can't, yeah, but, like, we're working with what we've got. What's the alternative? Like, the whole point of our teachings is to become God conscious. So if somebody's gay, like, okay, well, what are you going to do? Are you just like, it's about working from where you are and trying to move up one step. So like, if
someone
so might not be perfectly following, but I'm not perfectly following either.
Yeah. No, I mean, they can't convert to being straight, but should they not have sex?
Well, if somebody can be celibate, that's better. But are they going to be celibate? Like, celibacy is encouraged because, there's this whole idea of, like, your intelligence being better if you're celibate, because it's the energy that would have gone to being wasted in sexual energy goes up in your brain, and you become more intelligent, you're more mode of goodness, you're less distracted, you can think about God more. But most of us are not on that level. Most of us are not going to do that. And if we try to do that, we'll probably just end up being like the Catholic Church and having a whole lot of sexual abuse scandals. So better to have a nice consensual monogamous relationship than to have any of that promiscuous stuff happening.
I see.
And it might not be perfect, but, like, are any of us perfect? Maybe there's a few examples of perfect devotees. But for the rest of us, we just make the best of a bad bargain. We figure out what we're capable of and try to do better, and don't hold ourselves to too high of a standard. We have this principle called niyam agraha. It's a cool Sanskrit play on words, because when you combine two words together that have a syllable at the end, it becomes a long syllable. It becomes one syllable. It's like, I think there's a name for it in English where you change the sounds when you put two words together. Like, instead of saying apple, you say an apple. That's purely just to make it sound better. In Sanskrit, they do that all the time with all sorts of words. They combine the vowels in order to make it sound beautiful. Like, instead of saying Advaita Acharya, you say Advaita Acharya, because it's one name. So Niyama Agraha becomes Niyama Agraha with a long A, because it's two vowels combined. But it could be Niyam Agraha with the long A before the gray. So it's holding on to the rope too much or letting go of the rope too much, depending, because the A negates if it's a long A or a short A. Oh, if you have the A before graha, then it's not holding on. If you have no A there, then it is holding on. So either way, it sounds the same, but it has a double meaning. And so holding on to the rope too much means holding on to the rules and regulations too much, which means holding yourself to too high of a standard. I'm going to be the best Christian. I'm going to be the best Hare Krishna. I'm going to do all the things. And you do that for a couple of years, and then you burn out and completely reject your religion. Or you do that for a couple of years and you start, there's this saying, drinking water underwater while fasting on a fast day. So there can be fast where you don't have any water, but then when no one's looking, you're bathing, you're drinking some water while no one's looking. So people can be like that, where they're like doing all the things, they built this whole identity of doing all the things, but actually sneakily on the side, they're breaking the rules. And that's bad. Like, if anything's important in spiritual principles, it's honesty and integrity and being upfront and honest. So that's like super bad. So better to just be honest and follow a lower standard, and just be honest, I'm following a lower standard, here's where I'm at, and be consistent in that, than to be promiscuous on the side. So that's basically a whole philosophy of it's like an AA program. Like, let's just try to better ourselves.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I don't exactly see why non-reproductive sex is bad. So
it takes your consciousness, it distracts you from God. It's a kind of, so we use this word lust in a quite liberal way. The Sanskrit, I'm not sure what the Sanskrit correspondence to it would be, but it's basically anything that you can desire after. Could be a nice sports car. It could be sexual desires. It could be anything, desiring wealth, control over other people. And all this kind of hankering is a distraction from God. So what we're trying to cultivate is where we're absorbed in God consciousness and we get our satisfaction there. And one analogy I've used for in the past is it's something like, You know, if you brush your teeth with a really minty toothpaste and then you try to drink or eat something, the taste can be incompatible.
Yeah.
So when you're absorbed in pure love of God, you'll understand this kind of enjoyment takes away, just like the minty flavor takes away from other flavors. So I don't want any of that. I just want this higher flavor. That's what I want. I don't want these lower flavors. And if you're busy, it's like another analogy is like if you're in America, there's people who are both overweight and malnourished, which is a strange phenomenon, but there's only one way for that to happen, where you're eating food, but the food is not nutritious. So in a similar way, we have this like dopamine system, or if you want to look at it from the spiritual perspective, we have desires and we're hankering after things. And if we're constantly trying to fill our gob with things that don't actually give us satisfaction, we're busy chasing after things that won't fill that hole in our heart, then we could do that for a really long time and not make any progress in spiritual life. So if we actually have like a little bit of hunger, if we actually like a little renounced, then we have this longing for God, and then we'll actually act on that longing, seek God, and become more God conscious. Whereas if you're just constantly listening to all the nicest music and buying all the nicest things and just like completely materially satisfied, then your hankering for God will not be, you won't be acting on it.
I see. I mean, this reminds me of Freud's theory about, sublimated sexuality. You're sort of like playing into this.
Oh, right. Really, maybe Freud read the Vedas.
What?
Maybe Freud read the Vedas a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, except that, I take it that he was an atheist. So it was like, like the real source of energy is sexuality. It's just that when you frustrate it, then it starts like turning to other things. And, anyway. Well, I don't know. I mean, like it could be that you get like you get greater enjoyment by just like focusing on God than you get from all the the worldly pleasures. I don't really know, because like I don't have any experience with God. Like I don't have any religious experiences, so maybe they're really awesome. And, like maybe the reason I'm not having them is like I keep eating these cookies.
Yeah, we have this term we use called material exhaustion. I don't know. There's got to be a Sanskrit corollary for it too, but I don't know what it is just now. But there's the famous prayers of Queen Kunti in the Bhagavatam, which we quote a lot, where Queen Kunti had a pretty tragic life in a lot of ways. But Krishna was always coming in various ways and saving her, either like because they were contemporaries and he happened to be present in the more ordinary way, or because he would, in a more supernatural way, intervene on aspects, disasters she was in. And so in her prayer, she's saying, let these disasters keep happening if it means I can keep seeing you, because seeing you is such an amazing thing.
Yeah.
So, and in traditional Indian debates, a common argument is someone, because like in Bhagavad Gita, it said param drishva nivartate, one gives up a lower taste by experiencing a higher taste. So an argument for a particular understanding of the Vedas, a particular worldview or ontology, can be that somebody who was a member of one, who's believed one certain thing or was following a certain path, converted. And so there's the Atmarama verse that we quote. So Atmarama means someone who is self-satisfied. So it's like an impersonal kind of self-satisfaction where they're not engaged in bhakti and devotion to God, but they've connected with this kind of impersonal reality and they're getting satisfaction within like that. So if this person's not interested in keeping up with the Joneses. So like we see celebrities who have all the wealth in the world, anything material that you can think of that might make you happy from a material perspective, you can find a person who has that and is not happy. And so we constantly see celebrities saying, like somebody said to George Harrison, who was in India traveling around, who said he was unsatisfied. This guru said to him, "You're very lucky, because most people spend their whole lives trying to get on top of the wall, but you're very lucky because at a young age you've made it on top of the wall and figured out that there's nothing up there." So this shows that there's something higher. And in Indian circles there'd be arguments like, "Oh, but so and so was, they've realized this thing, but then when they heard Bhagavatam, they took interest, and this shows that the Bhagavat philosophy is higher. I'm trying to remember how this was tied into our discussion we were just having. Oh, spiritual experiences being great and helping you give up the lower thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. So I've heard religious people say this kind of thing before, like, oh, nothing provides satisfaction in life without religion. And then I always think, no, I'm doing great. Like, my life is very satisfying. What do you mean? But okay, I don't mean like that everyone is satisfied. Like, as some people, like you say, some people get rich and they still don't feel good. But it's not necessarily because they're missing God. It might be because like sort of like they haven't learned to be satisfied with things that are real. So you're like,
yeah, I suppose you could say that. I mean, what we'd want to say back is you're happy because of like mode of goodness things, like you've got this career where you do all this knowledge seeking and playing with ideas, and that's lots of fun and stuff. You have a career that suits your nature, so there's lots of things about your life that suit your psychophysical nature, and that's satisfying. But there's still a kind of satisfaction over and above that which you're missing out on, and you just don't know you're missing it because you've never tasted it.
Yeah, maybe. Or from my point of view, the simpler explanation is no. there isn't any such thing. But anyway, yeah, I think I think many people are not satisfied with their lives because they have sort of like shallow desires or something. So
yeah,
because the source of satisfaction in life isn't money, and it's not like getting ahead of your neighbors or whatever. The main sources of satisfaction are having meaningful relationships with other people and having meaningful work. So, if you have work to do that uses your talents and that feels meaningful to you, like, you think that you're doing something good and you're good at it, right? And it uses your talent. It's not just like, something trivial like digging ditches. Okay. Yeah. And then you have people in your life who you're close to that you have a strong relationship with, then I think you have a satisfying life.
Yeah, and I think even on a spiritual path, you need to have those things like in the Hare Krishna movement, you often see people engaged in services that are not according to their nature, and careers not according to their nature, and they're correspondingly not happy because we have a particular psychophysical nature, and that's there in the teachings. Actually, Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita, to do the work of another, even expertly, is, I can't remember what the word is. I think it's translated as sinful, but to do your work that's according to your nature, even though falteringly, that's good. And that might sound strange, but I think it makes a lot of sense if you put it in context. Like, I often give the analogy of a doctor versus a police officer. If the doctor starts trying to hand out punishments to people who he thinks deserve it, that would not be a good world to live in. Better that the doctor is only helping people and that's all they do, and the police officers can discriminate who needs punishment and who doesn't.
Yeah. It reminds me of an episode of the TV show House MD, which is a great show. There's an episode where like they have this patient come into the hospital who is a visiting African dictator. Right? Like, he's a dictator of a country in Africa, and he's killed lots of people, but he's in the United States and he got sick and he was brought into the hospital. Right. And so the doctors are deciding, should we save him? And, in the show, they wind up deliberately not saving him.
Oh, right.
They deliberately give him the wrong treatment and then he dies. And afterwards, like, House sort of like reviews what the other doctors did, and like he figures out that the doctor basically killed the patient, and House says, good, better a murderer than an incompetent doctor. Right? Because like he's trying to figure out whether the doctor made a mistake or he like deliberately let the patient die. And so he's glad that it wasn't a medical error.
Right. I don't know. I mean, there might be fringe cases where we want to make exceptions or something, but I would argue that it's often not that clear cut. Like that seeming dictator, if you killed that
Yeah,
person, then the person who replaces them might just be worse. And how do you know
yeah,
what's
that
going to
is true.
happen as a consequence of your actions? And you see that with like, oh, there's a funny bumper sticker, something about respect America or we'll bring democracy to your country.
Yeah,
It's like, and there's so many cases of you look at America going into these countries and how these countries ended up. It's like, are they? They're not much reason to think they're any better off for it. And yeah, geopolitics is a lot more complicated than trying to than just
that's true.
thinking. That's one thing that's so bad about politics on the left these days. It's like they try to make it about good versus bad. Like you just disagree with my political opinions because you're a bad person. And they make it about a moral thing. It's like we just need to go around campaigning to make more people good and then the world will be a better place. It's like, no, you need to figure out what's actually based on evidence, based on what's happened in the past, based on the current situation, will make things better and give arguments for that and persuade people and study other people's arguments and see if maybe they're seeing something that you're not.
Good point. Yeah. No, like I mean, I'm under the impression that a large number of people think that political issues are simple and trivial, right? Like they're intellectually trivial. You don't need
Oh,
evidence and reasoning because it's just self-evident what the right answer is. And then, you got like if that was true, you got to wonder like why there are so many people who disagree with your view.
it's because
And
they're
then
bad people.
yeah, yeah, that's the only thing you can say, right? Like if you think that the answer is obvious, and then there are all these people who don't want the obvious thing, then they must just be bad people. But I would say, well, maybe you're missing something.
Oh
Anyway,
yeah.
I mean,
Our
I
pro-
think this is partly because most people actually never in their life become informed about a political issue. When you become informed, and by that I mean you read from both sides, then you discover that almost all the controversial issues are complex, right? There's almost always intelligent arguments on both sides. That's
yeah,
why it's controversial.
that's been my experience too. If there's a widespread controversial issue, it's usually because there's truth on both sides of the issue, or at least it's not clear cut.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah.
our prime
Like
minister, our prime minister in New Zealand had the slogan "Be kind." It's like,
yeah,
is that
okay.
really what it's about? Is it really like? Anyway.
Well, I mean, the politicians don't like they don't want to sort of go into the actual issues, right? Because it's like there's even if he knows what the actual issues are, like he knows that he can't explain them to the voters because
Oh,
no one is going to sit there listening to him. So he has to sort of boil it down to like a slogan.
yeah. Maybe I'm naive, but I have a little bit more faith in human beings than that, and I think if you present them with a reasoned explanation and let the other side present reasoned explanations that like I might not be expert enough to study a subject, like I mean, the COVID example is probably not the best one, but like Norman Fenton is an expert scientist in his field, and you take another expert who has a disagreeing opinion, and you let them give their presentations, not like a dumpster fire debate, but give reasoned arguments, respond, take each other's objections seriously, and actually engage with them honestly and talk back and forth. I think the lay public could look at that discussion if it's presented in a lay version and popular level and understand it well enough to figure out which one of them's telling the better story.
Oh, I'm not sure they could do that. um, I think the people who would listen to the debate would probably do pretty well, but I think the overwhelming majority of people would refuse to listen to it.
Right. Or maybe that's how politics should be done. It's like, here's the issues that matter. Do you find this content interesting? No. Okay. Don't be a voter.
Yeah. Yeah.
Here's this important issue. Do you find the arguments either side interesting? Oh, yes, I love studying this stuff. Okay, let's hear your vote. Study the
Yeah.
stuff and then vote.
Yeah. I mean, I would like to discourage uninformed people from voting, but every election season, there are people with get out the vote campaigns, just try to get everyone to vote.
Well,
And it's like,
Didn't
Yeah.
Facebook they found Facebook was doing something where they were filtering for people who were going to vote a particular way, and then they were giving those people a particular message about going out and to vote, and they could sway the election. I don't know why that isn't more scandalous than it is, but that sounds pretty severe.
Yeah. Well, the get out the vote people are usually lefties, and they usually do their campaigns like on college campuses or in
Yeah.
sort of like democratic counties, right? So they're kind of doing the low tech version of that, right?
Yeah, I mean, on both sides of any issue, you're going to find people who have studied the argumentation and believe their position's true. But if the way you win voters is not by collecting all the people who study the argumentation, seeing what their votes are, but by seeing who can get the most people who haven't studied or thought about it at all to vote for their side, then I don't think that's a truth tracking process.
No, it's not. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like, what sort of who's good at giving sound bites, right? And like appealing to low information voters doesn't necessarily predict who's right about the real thing. Yeah. But it's sort of like, I mean, it's not really an easy thing to solve because if there's like 100 million voters, it's not rational for a voter to spend a lot of time thinking about his decision, right? It just wouldn't be rational, and it would be like a total waste of time to have 100 million people studying all the issues,
Yeah.
right? Which would take weeks, right? Or months. They might have to spend their entire lives studying issues if they wanted to have informed opinions about everything. And we don't need 100 million people doing that. So anyway, but also just from an individual standpoint, it's not rational to do it because you know that you're not going to make any difference. So you can contrast elections in a large country with juries in a jury trial. Like in a jury trial, I think they generally make reasonable decisions, I guess. Right?
Yeah.
Like they actually sit there and listen to all of the evidence.
Yeah.
Okay, but it's different because when there's only 12 people there, you can actually make a difference.
Yeah, totally.
But if there are millions of people, you can't make a difference. So there's no point in studying the issue, right?
Yeah.
So it's not obvious what the solution is to this situation.
No, it's definitely not obvious. Yeah. I mean, obviously something where you had an intelligentsia and they were the ones that voted would probably work better, but I don't see any way to bring that about where you're not just like who decides who the intelligent ones are.
Yeah.
Maybe you had a system where you just measure for people's interest in a subject matter, and if you're interested in it, because people who are interested in a subject could vote either way, but at least the interest means you'll study it and actually have some meaningful ideas about it. But if you're not interested in it, and maybe there's a way to filter for that, and I don't think that would be controversial. The last thing you want is something where somebody's deciding who can and can't vote. That would be terrible.
Yeah. I mean, people who are interested in a subject might have particular biases.
Yeah, but they're more likely to have studied it. Everyone's got biases. I don't think you can filter people out who have biases. I don't think that can be done. What you might be able to filter for is people who've actually thought about an issue.
Yeah.
You can have a questionnaire where there's like questions that have uncontroversial answers, and if you get them wrong, then you can't vote.
Yeah.
It just shows you're ignorant on the subject.
Yeah, no, like if you don't know how long the senator's terms are, or like if you don't know who the current senator is, like you don't know their name, maybe you shouldn't be able to vote on it. I don't know.
Something like that. Yeah. Anyway, one other point related to what you're saying is you talk like who makes the best soundbite. I noticed an interesting thing where TikTok, Instagram, and other Twitter, and maybe until recently, filter for left wing, whereas YouTube filters for more right wing ideas, like more conservative. And I noticed the difference is between those types of content platforms is the length of the content. So, like, there's some quote about it. I can't remember what it is, but like people tend to become conservative after the age of 30. It's like when you're young, if you have compassion, you're liberal. If you have compassion, and if you're old, if you're intelligent, you're conservative. Because basically when you're young, it's like, yeah, I care about the poor. Let's help the poor. Yeah, I care about all these disenfranchised people. Let's do all the policies. I care about the environment. Let's do all the policies. And then when you actually study the issue a bit deeper, you're like, oh, actually, those issues are complicated. And if you want to help the poor, just handing them money might not be the best way. Maybe there's a roundabout way of helping the poor that actually has a far better outcome for poor people, even though if you just look at the immediate actions being taken, it might not look like the thing you want to do if you just care about the poor. So it's like, some of these left wing's ideas are just the product of a deep lack of thought. Whereas if you go into the longer form content where issues are discussed at greater length, you might be a bit less left wing, at least in today's environment where the left wing is pretty extreme.
Yeah, part of what might happen, as far as why people become more conservative as they age, part of it might be that people become more cynical about human nature. Right? And so, right, because I think I'm under the impression that left-wing people think that poor people are like, it's just not their fault at all, right? When they're poor, it's just totally society's fault. Yeah. And also when people are committing crimes, that's just a failure of society. It's not a failure on the part of the criminal. And then as you get older and you have more experience with human beings, then you understand that no, it's their fault. Like the people who are committing crimes, a lot of them are bad people. That's why they're committing crimes. And the people who are poor, a lot of them are poor because, well, they made terrible choices that made them poor. And then you start feeling like, well, so the left-wing policies are designed to make other people pay for their mistakes, right? And you start feeling like that's not right.
That's definitely part of it. But I think that conservative idea of it's not their fault goes too far. And I think you could also say it from another angle, that it is society's fault that they've ended up like this. But the way to fix it is to fix society, not to just hand them out money. And we fix society by creating systems which cause the individuals growing up, being raised as children in that society, to come out of it with better character.
Oh, see, now you sound like a lefty. You sound like a socialist, because that's what they think.
Well,
they're going to solve crime by teaching people better.
I've never liked the identity of a conservative, and I've always kind of identified as left wing. And then when wokeism took over and I started criticizing all that stuff, I'm like, oh, maybe am I conservative? Like it was.
Well, yeah. So, well, old school liberals are disappointed by the direction the left has gone.
Okay, I must be an old school liberal then. Yeah, because when I hear old school liberal ideas, I'm like, yeah, like that. I mean, that COVID stuff's crazy because it's. I saw a really good meme about it, which I'm probably not going to be able to pull up as a good quip, but it's like, what happened to the left that got them shilling for pharmaceutical companies? Like, how did the left go from let's stick it to the man and, natural remedies and, the pharmaceutical companies are out to get you, to let's just all do exactly what the government's telling us to because they have our best interest at hearts, and let's give all our money to these pharmaceutical companies. They're saving us. And it's like, how on earth did that happen?
Yeah, well, I mean, I kind of know how it happened, right? Like at the beginning of COVID-19, Donald Trump tried to downplay it and say that it wasn't a big deal. And so therefore the left's reaction was, no, it's a huge deal. It's the end of the world. Oh my God, Trump says it's no big deal. It must be the end of the world. Oh, God. That just continued, right? And that, like Trump could have made a big deal about how the vaccine was great because like it was developed during his administration, but he just didn't make that big of a deal about it.
He did make a little bit of a big deal about it. People said they weren't going to get his vaccine.
Yeah, I mean, so he took credit for it, right? But I think what people remembered was stuff like him not wearing a mask, as if like, Oh,
and when he got COVID himself, he took ivermectin.
Yeah. So, yeah, whatever. But anyway, like, so I think it's partisan. Like if Trump had been like, oh my God, this is a terrible disaster, quick, everybody put on masks, then the left would be like, it's no big deal.
Yeah, I think
stop taking our freedoms. Right. And the right would be like, oh, you people don't care about safety.
Yeah, I think it's the same thing that happened in New Zealand in a way, because we had this conservative government. John Key had been in office for years, and then he resigned before the end of his term, and nobody really liked the guy who took his place. But like if John Key or the Conservative National Party was doing all this COVID stuff, I don't think the left would have bought into it. Which, I don't know. To me, that just shows that. Well, of course, people could say it's not true; they would have bought into it anyway. But I think if it's based on political divides like that, then it's not truth tracking. Obviously,
I think, yeah, you could say that, yeah.
Konstantin Kisin talks about this well. He says that, like, on both sides of the aisle now, you find, just like there's the current thing people that just basically, like, you could their Facebook picture will just be whatever the current thing is. I stand with Ukraine, or
Ukrainian
rainbow flag or what, and it just changes every couple of months with whatever the fad is. Current thing is, and you think sometimes maybe the current thing wasn't a good idea, but no, it's always a good idea, no matter what it is. Yeah. Even if it's putting the Ukraine flag on the rainbow flag where gay marriage is illegal. Still, but he says on the right, you find the same thing where it's just, I oppose the current thing-ism, where anything that the government or the left is saying a good idea, I oppose, even if I've never thought about the issue before. Like, immediately, I'm against standing with Ukraine, even though I've never thought about Russian-Ukraine politics ever in my life. Now I'm against it because it's the current thing.
Yeah. No, yeah. I mean, the thing is, like, most of these issues, you can see either side. Like, there's an argument for taking a hard line against Russia, and then there's an argument for trying to make peace, and they're both rational on the face of it. And so, like, you can, so then you can just, like, wait to see what your leader says, and then you can see that side of it, right?
Yeah, you can. Yeah,
right. So I can see both sides of this. I could see the side of, like, we have to stop Russian aggression. Like, they can't be allowed to take over, attack other countries, whatever, and, like, we have to deter future aggression and so on. And I could also see the side of, well, like, we're risking a nuclear war. Right? So we've got to make peace with them. Even though they're evil and whatever, we just have to make peace, and we have to, like, make compromises. Like,
yeah,
like,
exactly.
Those, they make sense on their face. And if I was more tribal than I am, then I would just pick whichever one of those arguments was being said by the people in my tribe.
Yeah, I mean, like, they track the amount of political polarization in the world by figuring out how many things you can predict about a person's opinions based on one of their opinions. But it's also funny when you see that play out where somebody switches from being a liberal to conservative, and they don't just change their opinion on a couple of the issues related to what bothered them about the left when they switched to the right. They change their opinions on absolutely everything across the board. And I don't know. I mean, I guess it's respectable to change your opinions, but I think if it's just flipping from one side to the other, the chances are you're just buying into an ideology and leaving another one behind, rather than actually having arrived at opinions that you have reason for believing to be true based on having thought about it.
Your point. Yeah. No, if you're, this is a sign of a test for rationality. Like, if your beliefs tend to line up with the stereotypical beliefs of a particular political party, right, like on multiple different logically independent issues, then you're probably not being rational, right? Like, you think there are all these different issues that are unconnected, right? Like, what does gun control have to do with abortion and the Ukraine war and whatever, COVID-19? Like, these are all logically unrelated issues. If you line up with either the left or the right on all of them, then, your beliefs are probably not rationally based.
Well, also, like, we can arrive at the best of both worlds in a way by taking the best thinkers of our time, or the best thinkers historically, and filtering out their best ideas and combining those with the best ideas from other people. Where it's like, you can't just, it's not like Shakespeare was a good person or a bad person. It's like, he was a product of his time, so maybe he had some bad qualities based on the current morality, but he's also a genius linguist, so let's study his use of language and learn something from it. And like, this whole thing where people think if somebody's an expert on one thing, like an excellent basketball player becomes a salesman for a particular product because, this basketball player, it's like, what does that basketball player know about those kinds of products? Nothing. Or political opinions. Why would you care what this basketball player thinks about politics? He's good at shooting balls into hoops. He's not good at political opinions. I mean, you could find the same person who's good at both things, but your reason for thinking they're good at the other thing is not because they're good at basketball. But it goes the other way with the cancel culture, where, like, I saw a while ago a biblical scholar who's criticizes Christianity and presents all this hard scholarship. He's widely respected for the integrity of his biblical scholarship, but then he's got some unsavory opinions on BLM and Trump, and and you listen to what he says on these things, and he's not the kind of person you're going to listen to for those subjects. Like, he's got his opinions, and like whatever, he's allowed to have his opinions, but like when people listen to him on his biblical scholarship, they don't find those same sloppy thinking that they find in his political opinions. So just ignore his political opinions and value the thing that he does well. But it's like, no, you've got to either throw the whole person out or keep the whole person. You can't just filter for it. It's the same thing in the Hare Krishna movement with gurus, where it's like, oh, this person had the wrong opinions on COVID, or they had the right opinions on COVID. It's like, no, they can know something about what the Hare Krishna teachings are, even if they have the wrong ideas about vaccines.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, like when people start thinking about politics, their IQ usually drops. So, so I think you can't judge the rest of somebody's work by their political views, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe we should probably wrap up soon, but I can quickly tie this into Hare Krishna ideas one more time, which is, you talked about having a diversity of opinions. Like, I heard Jordan Peterson talked about it quite well. He talked about an ideologue, which is a person who's just completely bought into some ideology, and they're kind of like a robot for that ideology. It's like, I think he quotes Nietzsche, talks about how people don't have ideas, ideas have people. So they're possessed by an ideology. And the way you can tell somebody is like that is because it's like they have a crank on the side of their head, and you turn it, and you can just predict what's going to come out. Anyone who's possessed by that same ideology, you turn the crank, the same stuff's going to come out. Whereas if Prabhupada talked about how he didn't want blind following or absurd inquiry. He wanted us to be independently thoughtful. Prabhupada, the founder of the Hare Krishna movement in the West. And so we're encouraged to be independently thoughtful. And then there's an example in Bhagavatam of Arjuna, one I'm named after in the Bhagavat Leela, who was faced with this dilemma. This evil person had done something bad. I'm trying to keep it short. And they needed to be punished. And he'd actually, the bad thing he'd done was killed the 5 sons of Draupadi. And while they were sleeping, just went and chopped their head off. Like, not like in battle killed them, like just went there in the night. We wanted to kill the Pandavas, but instead killed the 5 sons of Draupadi because the Pandavas weren't there, I think. And so Arjuna went and got him and brought him back. So here he is. Now we're going to punish him. And Draupadi said, he's the last living child of his mother. I'm heartbroken because my children have been killed and he killed my children, but I don't want his mother to be heartbroken by having all her children died. Don't kill him. And then Arjuna's brother Bhima was saying, no, we have to punish him. He's done something bad. This needs punishment. And Krishna said to him, now you have to satisfy both of them. So what he ended up doing was cutting off his hair and, basically humiliating him, because for someone who's honored, dishonor is worse than death. So in a way, in Vedic culture, dishonoring somebody is like killing them. So he satisfied both. But the point here is we understand Krishna, Arjuna, Bhima, and Draupadi are all pure devotees, which means whatever it is we're trying to become as devotees, they are already on that level. But they all have different opinions. Draupadi wants him not punished, and Bhima wants him punished, and Krishna's saying you have to satisfy both. So, in our theology, we expect differences of opinion, and if all of Hare Krishnas all have the same opinions all the time, maybe on a few clear-cut issues we should all think the same thing, like we should all think Krishna is the supreme personality of Godhead and Prabhupada is his pure devotee, and a few things like that. But then on other issues, we will expect to find differences of opinion.
Yeah, that sounds fair. That seems like a good example, like, just that you could see both sides of this, right? You could see,
they're both right. Yeah.
Here's a reason for executing him, and there's also a reason for not.
It reminds me of, I was listening to I think it was what's that big YouTube channel, the Drunken something, the Drunken Critic. He criticizes movies. I don't know if you've watched it. He explains why movies are bad these days, and one of the reasons is the bad guys are never believable anymore. Like, it used to be like the bad guy was sort of like, there was a bit of backstory and you could sort of see, like, I guess Thanos is like, he wants to save the world by destroying half of it.
Yeah.
And he thinks that's the way to make a better future. And it just so happens that we disagree, and that's not the way to make a better future. And even if that would make a better future, you just can't do that. You just can't kill that many people. It's wrong.
Yeah.
And whatever the tension is, but there's a tension that's believable. And I'm sure there's lots of better examples from like older Star Trek videos where the good character makes a bad decision, but you still like them for it because you can understand what went into it. Whereas these days there'll be like this good character, like, protagonist, but he's like some white bumbling idiot. So when he does something stupid, it's not believable. It's just, oh yeah, he's the buffoon character, so he did something stupid. There's no believable. I'm just going off on a tangent now.
Yeah, no. Like I think about the villains in Star Wars. Like the Emperor is just pure evil, and and they even call their side the dark side.
Yeah, sorry, one sec. Sorry, we're just trying to decide whether I wrap up now and carry it, and then go out now, or just she goes out and I carry it on with stuff around the house.
Okay. Yeah, we should probably wrap up shortly.
Yeah, let's just finish off. You want to finish your thought?
Yeah, no, so it was just like, comparing movies with good villains.
Yeah, okay, I'm listening. I'm just going to call my wife's phone.
Sorry, yeah.
She's got to find it. Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about, movies with good villains versus bad villains. And like in Star Wars, even though I love Star Wars, like the villain is not really believable because like, like what does he believe in? Pure evil or something, right? And then, think of another example. Think of the Joker movie. Did you see that?
I didn't watch it, but I heard it criticized.
Oh, okay. I mean, it made sort of like a strikingly good effort at showing the perspective of the Joker. It's like, because before that you're like, this guy is just like insane and evil, right? But then when they give the backstory, you're like, oh, I understand how he got that way. So,
yeah, I think that ties into what we were talking about before, because I think it's a product of the other thing. So this whole straw manning of the other positions is a result of this lack of understanding. Sorry, I'll edit these bits out. Yeah, I think this relates to what we've been talking about, because I think the way the movies are made by people who are a product of the culture we live in. And so the people making movies they're also influencing the culture. So it's both things, but it relates to the same thing of issues are super simple. There's bad people and good people. So when they write villains, they don't know how to write good villains because they don't understand the actual sources of disagreement in the world and why people carry out policies that don't have good results or have disagreements. And probably if the movies were a bit more nuanced, maybe the people would be a bit more nuanced. It's probably a two-way street.
Yeah, that could be. I would like to see more movies and, read more stories in which there's a conflict between people who are not just good and evil, like, people who have intelligible reasons for being on their opposing sides.
Yeah, well, The Critical Drinker gave an example, I think, from a Star Trek episode where one of the main characters did something bad, but it was fully understandable why he made that decision, because like he was wronged in the past by certain like peoples, and so he made a decision to do something bad for those peoples because of like, someone, I can't remember the details, and you could understand, you knew it was the wrong thing to do, but you could understand why he did the wrong thing. It was believable. And even when you gave the example of Darth Vader just like believing in bad, but even with him in the older Star Wars movies, the way he acted was very expert. It wasn't just like, you could understand like the way he was carrying out his things, and it was like more believable, like rather than just like fit. They have this portrayal of evil characters of just having fits of anger, and it's like, how could this person carry on this expert operation when they're clearly so incompetent? Like,
I did wonder like how the Empire works if Darth Vader periodically just like kills the leaders, right? So, some admiral or something comes out of hyperspace too early and he just like kills.
Actually, there's a Star Wars, there's a YouTuber who made some really interesting Star Wars movies explaining how the rebels were actually the bad people. And like they go into a lot of meta ethics. You'd probably find it interesting. If you want, I can maybe find the link. It goes into a lot of meta ethics, how like what the rebels were pushing for was actually in a lot of ways unethical, and like the emperor said, I've got these emergency powers just to deal with this rebellion, and as soon as the rebellion's gone, I'll renounce them and resign. And the rebels just wanted to make that guy renounce and resign, get rid of him or kill him, because they thought he was a bad leader or whatever. And he said, the moment the rebels are gone, I'm out of here. I'm only here to deal with the rebels. I don't know the Star Wars universe well enough to comment on it. I just thought it's interesting. They made some strong arguments, and I was almost convinced. And I thought, I guess it just shows how you could spin a story either side. But I think the ability to do that shows high quality writing. I don't think you could take a modern Star Wars movie and do that.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think it shows creativity by the fans. You know?
Maybe. No, but you can only do that kind of creativity if you've got quality material that you're working on.
Yeah.
There has to be a certain amount of nuance written into the movie to begin with.
I mean, I think that might have been accidental. Like, I think George Lucas might have intended it to be simple, but anyway.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay, we should wrap it up. We ranged far more subjects than I'd pitched, but they're both issues we find interesting. So it was lots of fun talking to you. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.